Greetings. Congratulations on finishing week one. It looks like you all are getting the rhythm of the class, and I really have appreciated your interactions in the forum so far, both in the introductions and in your reading. So, yeah, well done. Uh, just a quick reminder about your reflections. So, your reflections on the Sermon on the Mount article, the Doing Not Dualism, is due this evening by 5. If you're not quite getting all the reading done, at least the first week or two, there's a little bit of flexibility in the sense of just we need to get the schedule and kind of rhythm and the flow of the class. If you haven't introduced yourself or you haven't posted in the reading forum, then please do as you kind of finish out this week, especially introduction and then hopefully the reading forum as well. And then one reminder, when you're posting in your reading forums, make sure that they're kind of like a journal reflection. I would like to see, and I think your classmates would like to see, how you're interacting with the material, not necessarily a summary of the material. I can get kind of how you're understanding the material and basically how the class is understanding the material as I read your reflections, kind of what stood out to you, what questions that you had as you read the article, etc. So, yeah, basically how it struck you, the questions you have, those kinds of things, is what's more important in that particular reflection. Let me just say a couple things about your readings today. The article on the Sermon on the Mount is from Kingdom Ethics, as you've read, written by Glenn Stassen and David Gushee. This particular chapter, the one on Doing Not Dualism and the Triadic Initiatives of the Sermon on the Mount, are written by Glenn Stassen. This was a part of his original Sermon on the Mount research, and so we're going to start there, and we're going to start there for a couple of reasons. The first reason is the Sermon on the Mount and its emphasis on peacemaking. If you just read chapter 5 of that sermon, of Jesus' sermon, you will see that he comes out strong with some very important peacemaking principles. In the Beatitudes, he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Then quickly in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26, it's a passage on murder and anger. And as you read, the emphasis and the imperative is on making reconciliation with one another. Then you have in Matthew 5:38 the admonition to turn the other cheek and to give your cloak and to walk the second mile, which we will need to talk about that a little bit more, and we'll look at Walter Wink's article, Jesus' Third Way, when we look at that, because there's more to that than just a kind of pacifism and acceptance. There's a strong emphasis on maintaining dignity even in the midst of relationships with people in power when you don't have that kind of power. So yeah, that's going to be an important caveat or distinction as we look at that passage. But it's a strong passage on going the extra as followers of Christ. So we have that. We have Matthew 5:43 through 48 on loving your enemies. They are your enemies. Now Jesus is pushing our moral boundaries outward, and your enemies are should be a part of your moral concern and a part of your affection if you're a follower of Christ, which he demonstrated, right? He demonstrated on the cross, he demonstrated in the resurrection, and he demonstrated it in the availability of the kingdom of God to all. So the Sermon on the Mount starts strong in a peacemaking direction. And then as it closes in Matthew chapter 7, after some of the integrity passages of praying in secret, giving in secret, etc., and eternal perspective passages, you get in Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, the famous passage on do not judge, which is often taken out of context. But the important aspect of that passage is the emphasis on self-reflection. That is the first place that you should turn when there's a conflict, or when there's an injustice, or when there's something that is pressing in on you, is you should turn towards yourself in self-reflection to make sure that you were taking care of, quote unquote, the log in your own eye before you take the speck out of somebody else's eye. So that's an emphasis on self-reflection. And then chapter 7 verse 12 is the golden rule. So all of this plays into peacemaking somewhat. So we have this strong emphasis on peacemaking. The second reason that we're reading this article is because it's going to lead to the textbook that we are reading right after Lisa Cahill in the Interfaith Just Peacemaking textbook. So Glenn did his research on the Sermon on the Mount and came up with this kind of triadic initiative interpretation, where there's the traditional saying, and then there's the vicious cycle, right? The anger, let's take the murder passage. The anger creates a vicious cycle. And then the transforming initiative is the grace-based reconciliation that we can move towards because of the grace that Christ showed to us. So out of that research came this book, Just Peacemaking. This is by Glenn Stassen. He was my advisor in during my PhD. And he's the one that asked me to kind of help him take up this class. Ideally, if he would have lived longer, what we wanted to do was I would teach the class, the academic portion, and then there would be a second portion, which would be a field experience class, going to Israel and Palestine and doing some peacemaking there. But with Glenn's book, Just Peacemaking, he's going to argue for 7 principles of peacemaking anchored in the Sermon on the Mount. And so this is a book on Christian ethics. This is a book in relationship to using violence, even in justified cases. And he's going to say you have pacifism on one hand and just war theory on the other hand, and there's a lot of room in between for peacemaking practices. Let's look to the Sermon on the Mount and begin to adopt some of these peacemaking practices. So he develops 7 of them. Out of that, he begins to look around and say, maybe there are more peacemaking practices than are in the Sermon on the Mount, but that have been historically proven to reduce the amount of violence in and between cultures. And so what he did then was commission a project of several contributing authors to edit this book, Just Peacemaking. And he expands the 7 principles of peacemaking in his first book to 10 principles. So he'll, based on sociological analysis, he'll include things like promoting democracy is a peacemaking practice. You won't find that in the scriptures. There's no promotion of democracy in the scriptures. But what he says is that when you see mature democracies develop, this is not how democracies get started, but when they mature, then violence decreases. Violence in society and then violence between democratic countries. And so 10 authors contribute to the 10 principles of just peacemaking from there. But it's a broadly ecumenically Christian ethic again. And then one of the authors begins to take this a little bit further and says, can we find in the 3 Abrahamic traditions some common ground to advocate for these peacemaking practices? And so that's the book that you're going to read. That's the textbook, is Interfaith Just Peacemaking. And so we're going to look at these 10 peacemaking practices in the Jewish tradition, in the Islamic tradition, and then in the Christian tradition, and see how they compare and contrast with one another there. And so I wanted you to get started with the Sermon on the Mount article because this is kind of the catalyst for how these peacemaking practices and principles that will be so important to our class and to peacemaking in general, especially in international relations. And then we can draw some principles outside of international relations from these practices in order to advocate for peacemaking in certain situations and questions and struggles that we have in our own culture. So that's how that all developed. So that's why I wanted to start with that article on the Sermon on the Mount, just to give you an idea of his interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount and then how that progressed into some peacemaking practices. Finally, what I want to say is that you have started and will continue to read Blessed Are the Peacemakers by Lisa Cahill. This is a very similar argument. And so what Lisa is doing in this book is she's going to define pacifism and pacifisms, because there's different kinds of pacifism. And then she's going to define just war theory and a few different kind of edges around just war theory. And then she's going to talk about how do we build peace, right? And so what does it mean to be peace builders? And so you've already gotten started. We'll finish this book fairly quickly. Reading's a little heavy in the first couple of weeks, but it will lighten up over time, hopefully. What you want to be paying attention to when you read Blessed Are the Peacemakers is you want to be paying attention to how she begins to articulate what pacifism is. And then you want to be paying attention to how she articulates what just war theory is. We're going to add some layers of texture to her definition, but you want to pay attention to those, because that will be on your midterm essay. I'll ask some questions or have some prompts about defining just war theory and pacifism. And then we're going to talk about how does peacemaking and the practices of peacemaking or peace building fit inside of both of those paradigms, right? And so how does it relate to pacifism? How does peacemaking relate to pacifism? And then how does peacemaking relate to just war theory? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, and I'm going to have a prompt about that as well. And then finally, the last prompt will be how do you compare and contrast Lisa Cahill's argument for peace building to the argument in interfaith just peacemaking? Where do they have some common overlap? And then where do they diverge or differ from one another? So you'll want to be paying attention to those kinds of things as you read these next two books, because that will be what you're writing your midterm essay on in week 5. And you'll have all week to develop that. It's not an exam. It's just working on an essay. And I'll post a study guide or the prompts to the essay probably, let me think about that, probably on Monday, because then I will have to be traveling from Tuesday to Friday down to LA to visit some colleges for my daughter. So I want to give you kind of the broad context and then how our next couple of textbooks fit into that context. So have a great weekend. Don't work too much on the weekend unless you have to catch up a little bit. And then remember to try to respond by Monday to your fellow classmates' posts and their journal reflections, and then take up your reading then for week number 2 on Monday. Okay, thanks again for getting a great start to class. Really interesting folks in class, a diverse group of people living all over the world. That's what makes online learning so exciting. I'd love to have you all in class in person, but this is the next best thing. So I hope you're enjoying class so far, and we'll talk again early next week.